Welcome to Not So Quiet on the Western Front, the podcast where we lift the lid, bust the myths, and explore the incredible history of the First World War. I'm Dan Hill, a military historian and battlefield guide specialising in the history of the war on the Western Front.
And I'm Dr. Spencer Jones, author and senior lecturer in war studies at the University of Wolverhampton. In this episode, we'll take a look at how language, slang, and battlefield terms, created or popularised in the First World War, have found their place in the modern English language, and explore some of their fascinating and surprising origins.
So just a little bit of housekeeping ahead of today's episode to let you know that if you're currently enjoying these podcasts via YouTube, from this point onwards, we're actually going to be moving the podcast away from YouTube into the more dedicated podcasting space. So you'll still be able to find us. We're not going anywhere. Plenty more episodes to come, but you can do that via now the more traditional podcasting routes. And that's going to be either Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Pocket Cast, or really anywhere that you find shows of this kind. We can still be found, so if you are currently listening via YouTube, do please head over to any of those. We'll be really glad to join you over there. Drop us a quick review if you haven't already done so. Everything can still be found. It's still totally free, so we'll look forward to seeing you as of next week on one of those platforms. So with that out of the way, Spence, let's get straight into this week's episode.
Hello again, Dan. Always a pleasure to be joining you on the podcast. And this podcast is a little bit different to just about everything else we've covered. We've looked at battles, we've looked at aspects of the First World War, but now we're going to be looking at a legacy in some ways of the First World War that's still with us today in some cases, and that's the origins of slang terms, soldiers' phrases, and other quirks of the English language that still echo 100 years on.
Definitely. Really looking forward to this one, actually. I think it might be a little more lighthearted than some of the previous subjects we've covered, but fascinating nonetheless. And you know, I was thinking when we decided that we were going to cover this as a subject, there's a huge amount that's either directly related to the First World War or at the very least popularised as a result of the First World War. And I wonder how many people use some of these terms. I should add here, we are going from a fairly British perspective. Some of these terms for our international audience may mean little or even nothing. But there are certainly phrases that will be used, that are used in modern English in the UK, which can find their origins back in the First World War. And that's what I find fascinating, because a lot of us will stumble through this legacy on a daily basis using phrases, not knowing exactly what their original background was. And for me, that's endlessly fascinating. In fact, the general idea of soldiers in the First World War and how they make their way out to the Western Front, which of course is France and Belgium, and kind of navigate the difficulties and the intricacies of the language barrier there is fascinating in itself, isn't it?
It really is. And a point to make about this is the English language in the 1800s was being influenced by lots of words that were coming in from the empire, especially from India, which significant numbers of British soldiers and indeed British citizens, administrators would rotate through. They would pick up words in India and they bring them back to the UK. And in some ways, the origins of soldiers' slang begins in India and then develops onwards. But what made it so popular and what made it have this lasting influence is the sheer number of British citizens who become involved in the war in some way, shape or form. Millions of men will serve in the armed forces. Similar numbers of women will serve either in factories or in nursing roles, and they'll also pick up elements of soldiers' slang. Newspapers and magazines, seeking authenticity, started to report exactly how the soldiers spoke. And of course, this slang didn't end when the war ended. People came back with it. They brought it back into British society and they started to share it more and more. And so what had originally become, as all slang is, a form of language which identifies you as being part of a group. You use it to show, look, I'm one of you. I know your language. I speak your language. Soldier slang is a classic example of that. Old soldiers would use slang and slang phrases that sometimes could be bewildering to incoming soldiers, but to make themselves appear grizzled and to try and make themselves appear part of the group, they would start to use the slang as well. But what's fascinating is because the war was such a huge influence on British society, unlike other soldierly slang, and there's plenty of that in the 1800s, which doesn't really enter the common language, in this case, so much soldiers' slang goes from the Western Front into British society and in some cases is still with us today.
Yeah, and I think one of the elements that's really important with that is the idea of the Western Front being just this enormous multicultural melting pot as well. If you think of this fairly limited area of the world in southern Belgium, northern France, and you just inject millions of individuals from dozens of countries into that area, and you get them to rub shoulders in a fairly horrific, albeit exciting in many ways, environment, and get these guys to engage on a daily basis, you're gonna get this kind of evolution of almost a sub language develop, and we can really see that. There's a lot of nicknames that come about. There's a lot of phrases that swap between regiments and battalions and between nations and get popularized generally. There's a lot of, sort of satire and dark humor that comes about, and we see that come out in the language as well. And of course, one of the things that we immediately get, given where the Western Front is problems and ways of trying to get around those problems of language. And one of them that I find really fascinating as well is Anglicization of town names, particularly. If you imagine we're in northern France, it's of course French speaking, and then southern Belgium around Ypres is going to be Flemish speaking. So there's a lot of Flemish speaking town names. Flemish sounding town names, I should say. And for a young lad from East London or from Birmingham or from the northeast coal mines who's never been out of his country before, to try and say somewhere like Vlamertinge or Goedverdersvelde or Ploegstert, it's just not doable. And so we see this kind of stuff get anglicized, and it happens all over the Western Front. And some of my favorite names come about as a result of this. In fact, I'm guilty on battlefields of still using them to this day. So, for example, down on the Somme, the village of Mailly is known as Mallet Mallet, which I think is particularly good. Vlamertinge becomes Vlamentinge. Goedverdersvelde, one of my favorites, become known as God Wears Velvet or Gertie Wears Velvet. Wieschater is White Sheets, and the list goes on and on and on. Etaples, the famous field hospital, becomes Eat Apples. So you can see how these kind of shortcuts are taken and corners are rounded slightly. And you can see in that, I think, Spence, some of the first evolution of language on the Western Front.
You can, and I can absolutely sympathise with the soldiers of the Western Front anglicising names, because despite my best efforts over the years, my ability to learn language and retain language is almost zero. And I know just from our experience working together, Dan, I'm quite famous for mangling some of the more difficult, challenging French and Flemish names. So I'm very glad that English soldiers actually anglicised them at the time. And this, of course, is also a way of speaking in group, because if you've just arrived on the Western Front and you don't really know the locations, particularly if you're an officer and you probably do have a little bit of French to your in your skill set, you might look at places, Etaples, for example, and you would understand it as that. And then your common soldiers are walking around talking about eat apples. You don't actually know what that means. And so it's actually a way to identify you within the group as well, that you're a veteran. If you know these anglicized names, well, you've been out on the Western Front for a while. And old soldiers will use this as a way to appear more knowledgeable to their young charges. And that way the slang is reproduced. And probably the most famous, I think, anglicization of a place name has to be Ypres, which is been renamed Wipers, and gives us, of course, various the most famous publication, trench publication of the Western Front, a fascinating story in themselves, trench newspapers, which is the Wipers Times. But they've also saved the blushes of historians such as me and battlefield guides for the next century, because it's always possible, if you can't pronounce a French name, you can say, well, we're going to use the anglicized name, just like the soldiers did in 1914.
Absolutely. And, there's lots of, we could spend the whole hour talking about these examples of anglicized names and probably never repeat ourselves once. But there are also, of course, other things that we can look at, and regimental histories, and a bit of what you might call the banter out on the Western Front comes about. And, of course, is very prevalent today in the British Army, that you see with regards to regiments. And there's, I think, a little bit of regimental rivalry in there. There's a little bit of tongue-in-cheek stuff, and there's probably a bit of bitterness as well in between different regiments. And a couple that really stick in my mind is the Royal Army Medical Corps, who get quite a tough time amongst the rest of the army. Of course, it's a non-combatant branch of the British military at the time, who the RAMC, Royal Army Medical Corps, and the distinct nickname Runaway Mothers Coming, as well as the rather unfortunate one, rob all my comrades, due to a suggestion that wounded troops get their pickets pocked. Due to the suggestion that wounded troops get their pockets picked as they're coming back from the front lines. We should also point out on the other side of that spectrum, of course, the RAMC responsible for 2 of the 3 double Victoria Crosses in history, and also a larger proportion of Victoria Crosses than any other branch of the British military. So there are 2 sides to that coin, most certainly. Another one that sticks in my mind, the first territorial unit out on the Western Front, Churchill's own, the QOOH, the Queen's own Oxford Hussars, who become known as the queer objects on horseback, which I think is pretty good.
These classic names that come out are, again, a great way that soldiers express humour. And the one you've just mentioned about the Royal Army Medical Corps, which, as you say, does incredible work on the Western Front. It shows incredible bravery often. The idea that you're going to be robbed once you actually end up in the base, in the hospitals, since you're being treated by this, is really prevalent. So as well as rob all my comrades, there's also rob all men's clothes. And these capture something about what the common infantryman in the trench actually tends to think about this. In reality, quite often, when you've been badly wounded, objects in your pockets have probably fallen out. Perhaps you've been blown in the air by an explosion, or who knows. The idea that there was theft going on in the Royal Army Medical Corps is extremely common amongst frontline infantry. Maybe a bit of it was going on. You've got an army of enormous numbers here, but it's one of my favourite sort of trench slang terms for a unit. And I've even seen it listed as somebody went to see the robbers, and you think, well, who are the robbers? It's the Royal Army Medical Corps. So these things do catch on, and there's others as well. So the Army Service Corps, which is responsible for all kinds of supplies coming up, they're actually absolutely essential to the running of the army, basically the logistics arm of the British Army on the Western Front. So the ASC, Army Service Corps, becomes Ali Sloper's cavalry, which gives us some sort of idea about the speed in which they're actually moving. It's often felt the Army Service Corps, not unreasonably, has some of the slowest, worst horse stock in the entire army. The Royal Artillery and the cavalry tend to get the best horses. Then the heavy artillery tends to pick up some other horses, and what's left for the Army Service Corps? Well, whatever you can lay your hands on. Mules, donkeys, nags, anything that can move stuff forward. And of course, one of the common complaints is the Army Service Corps is not bringing the food up. Where's our hot food? It's been delayed. Well, it's because they've got the worst possible horses. So it's interesting that a lot of these nicknames basically are derogatory, but in a sort of humorous and friendly way towards towards branches of the British Army.
Yeah, true, very true. And I think there's also, when we look at this today, I think from a British point of view, it's maybe easier to understand with a little more of an insider knowledge on slang in general, which has always formed a big part of British society. But perhaps for someone who's not so invested in that subject, some of them might be trickier to find a direct lineage, as in how people from Scotland could have been referred to as sweaty socks in the First World War, which is unusual and a very broad, sweeping statement. It actually comes from Cockney rhyming slang, which is the idea of taking words which sound phonetically like another word and then replicating that through several different derivations until you find a word that then refers to something completely different and often sounding completely unlike it. So Cockney rhyming slang, which would sweaty socks, would be derived from jocks being the nickname for Scotsmen. So sweaty socks was used out on the Western Front to describe the Scots, of all regiments, it should be said. And there are plenty more where that came from. But it is fascinating. I think more interestingly, Spencer, as well, when it comes to phrases that have got a really direct lineage to the First World War, either because they're born in the First World War, in many cases from new technology or new branches of warfare that come about, or ones that have a popularization during that time. So things that may have been popular perhaps even centuries before then come about. And I just want to throw a few around and explore this incredible language a little bit. The one that sticks in my mind that's got a real nailed-on First World War background is blotto. Blotto in Britain today would mean somebody being very drunk. That's the general idea. And this one comes very likely from a famous tricycle, a French tricycle from a couple of years before the war, known as the Blotto Frères tricycle. So it's the Blotto brothers create this tricycle, which is notoriously unstable. So the idea is that these are a very common sight on French and Belgian roads during the First World War, and it will be some poor civilian or perhaps even military messenger seen cycling down the road with this very unstable bike weaving all over the place, trying to keep it on all three wheels. And the result is the idea of somebody weaving down the road looking particularly unstable, you would describe them as being blotto. Now, if you remove them from the bike and you continue the phrase, if you see somebody drunk walking down the road looking very unstable, they would be blotto also. And even today that is used. My mother uses the phrase blotto from time to time. So I like it. It's a good First World War phrase.
Absolutely. And it's one of those that I know just from teaching undergraduate students. Even now in the 21st century, I've heard students refer to themselves as being blotto, or more often, their friends being blotto. I mean, they don't necessarily tell me this, but I certainly overhear it wandering around the coffee area, things like this. So blotto has entered the English lexicon as a way of just saying absolutely plastered and completely done. And I have to say, Dan, I didn't actually know it came from the tricycle. So I've actually learned something on this podcast to this day as well. So there we go. We learn from each other on this podcast.
So, I mean, there's plenty more to choose from, Spence. I think there's one of the subjects which I think is really interesting. Now, these phrases aren't necessarily ones which are still used today, but I think it's interesting to look at how 1914 influences of the time are used to describe things around the battlefield. And weapons and enemy weapons in particular are things that are quite often given nicknames which relate more to home, and often based around the properties or the characteristics of that particular weapon. Famous one would be looking at artillery shells, of which there are a number of different things: flying pigs, flying sausages, jam jars, and of course, famously, there's the Jack Johnson.
There is, and this is one of my sort of favourite nicknames for a weapon. Jack Johnson, for those you don't know, was the heavyweight boxing champion of the world at the time, and he distinctly was black, which was pretty sensational in the world of the early 1900s. And he definitely wore his identity very strongly. There's actually a terrific book about Jack Johnson called Unforgivable Blackness, which charts his life, a very colourful and chaotic life. Great fighter of his era, but he was extremely famous. Boxing was huge in Britain in 1914, a huge spectator sport, hugely followed. And Jack Johnson was the most famous boxer in the world. And so when the British started to encounter German heavy artillery, specifically the 15-centimetre gun known in the British Army as the 5.9, reducing its 15 centimetres to an inch measurement, which the British used, they referred to the shells that came howling in from this particularly heavy gun as Jack Johnsons. And one of the reasons for that is you could sometimes see just the black blur of a 5.9 shell as it plunged down. Not always, and I'm not sure if you were close enough to see that black blur, you were probably too close to it. But people observed these flying black objects coming down, and of course, where they struck, they blasted into smithereens. This was a heavy shell with a big blasting charge, very heavy. And so when a Jack Johnson flew at you, you got knocked out. And more specifically, you got smeared. These things were very powerful, a very powerful gun that really was a problem for the British for the entire First World War, and a prime target to be knocked out by counter-battery fire. And other names were given to the Jack Johnson that reflect something of it too. So it was also known as the coal box, because again of that black smear, you'd see as the shell came plunging down, and if you get hit by a runaway coal box, well, that's going to smash you into pieces as well. They were also known as woolly bears, which is a more generic term for German heavy artillery, big heavy German shells, which the soldiers couldn't necessarily identify. They just knew they were under heavy German fire. Woolly bears would come in. The origin of woolly bears, I have to say, completely eludes me. Why they were called this, I don't know, but you didn't want to be hit by a woolly bear, that's for sure. But perhaps the most common phrase for German artillery, and also it could be applied to British artillery shells generally, was whiz-bangs. And this is just capturing what the sound of these shells sounded like. There'd be a whiz as it howled overhead, and then there'd be a bang. And whiz-bangs could be applied to British shells, French shells, German shells of any size or shape. And there's other nicknames that get applied to weapons generally. So trench mortars, which tended to have a very large, observable and round ammunition perched on the top of them in the early part of the war, were known as toffee apples, because that's what they look like. The tube of the mortar looked like the stick, and the ammunition looked a bit like the apple. And probably my favourite nickname, and it's a little bit difficult to actually pin down where this comes from. It may have been a journalist's invention, but it's just got such a ring to it, is the Lewis gun. So the Lewis gun, a light machine gun, widely employed by the British and also employed by the Americans in 1918 as well. Man-portable, really a two-man machine gun, massively manufactured, widely used. The Americans nicknamed it the Belgian rattlesnake because it made this distinctive rattling sound when it fired. Now, whether soldiers actually called it the Belgian rattlesnake is a little bit difficult to pin down. Certainly American journalists like to call it the Belgian rattlesnake. And I think that is such an American nickname for a gun. And it makes it sound cool, and it makes it sound edgy, and it makes it sound dangerous. Whereas British slang for weapons tends to be slightly ironic or slightly mocking or things like this. And I think that actually tells you something about the difference between British soldiers' outlook on the war and American soldiers' outlook on the war.
Yeah, I suppose it does, actually. Now you're mentioning weapons, I was thinking of a few more as we were coming up there. Grenades, of course, famously nicknamed. So the French grenade, the lemon grenade because of the shape of it. The German grenades, there's several of them. You've got an egg grenade, which looks like an egg, rather unsurprisingly. You've got a turtle grenade, also known as the discus hand grenade, which looks rather like a flattened turtle with its 4 little prongs sticking out. And, of course, you have the famous potato masher as well, the steel hand grenade. So a couple of different options like that. The British, on the other hand, we've got the Lee Enfield, the famous 303, the rifle most often used in the front lines by most troops throughout the entire Great War. Short magazine Lee Enfield, SMLE, of course, always shortened to Smelly. So there are plenty of things that we can follow like that, and I find absolutely fascinating. There's also quite a lot of stuff behind the lines as well. And when we're talking about popularization, it's not only words that come back, but also, in many ways, food and drink come back, including recipes. So one of the famous foods to be popularized during the First World War is ham, egg, and chips. Really simple fare, often bought by soldiers in local estaminets, which are kind of ad hoc, sometimes formal, sometimes completely ad hoc restaurants behind the line. If you've got a spare front room in your house and you're a French or Belgian civilian, quite often you'll cook up ham, egg and chips for passing soldiers and make a bit of money that way. That meal is transported backwards behind the lines after the war and becomes a real staple food in Britain for a number of years. And of course, you want to wash that down. One of the things you might wash that down with is a cheap bottle of white wine, known as Vin Blanc at the time. Again, sometimes tricky for the British soldier to say, so on occasion gets shortened. And it gets shortened and anglicised to plonk. And plonk becomes cheap white wine, which, of course, for those of you white wine drinkers out there, or just cheap wine drinkers in general, plonk is going to be a phrase that you'll know, no doubt.
It really is. And plonk is ubiquitous. Something to remember, listeners, is that in Britain prior to the First World War, wine is not drunk by the working class. It is a drink. Really, it's a drink of the aristocracy, and it's a drink of the middle class who wish to ape the aristocracy. The British working class drinks beer and has drunk beer for centuries. And exposure to French wine in considerable quantities is the first encounter many British soldiers have actually had with wine. And of course, the wine in some respects is easier to drink than beer. And so young soldiers, they're suddenly exposed to wine. They don't really know how to judge how much wine they're drinking. You know, it goes down quite easily. They don't really realize how much they're drinking. And it becomes really popular, and plonk becomes ubiquitous and in many ways replaces beer as the drink of the soldiers in France. Because as you say, Dan, it's much easier to acquire plonk than it is to actually acquire beer. Soldiers still drink beer as well, but plonk becomes absolutely part of the vocabulary. And it changes British drinking habits because soldiers go back to Britain. They tend to actually go back to drinking beer, but wine as a drink of the working class traces its origins back to the 1920s. Soldiers returning, well, some of them have actually got a taste for wine, a taste for plonk. They want to keep drinking it even though the war's over. And this leads to the mass production, or mass importation, I should say, of cheap wine in the 20s and 30s to this day. So if you're ever in the supermarket and you see some of those under £5 bottles of wine, and you go, ooh, gosh, that's going to be a bit acidic. Well, you can thank a British Tommy for that, and coming home in the 1920s saying, well, I still want to drink that cheap wine I was enjoying in France in 1917.
Indeed. And if beer or wine, if neither of them are particularly your thing, you might fancy a bit of rum. And of course, rum is also freely available out on the Western Front. It is something that is issued by the British Army as standard. So there is a rum ration which is delivered to troops in the front lines and in behind the lines. One of the things that very often happened as well, or reportedly very often happened, is that the Army Service Corps, who are responsible for delivering these supplies up to the front line, would be known to snaffle a little bit and sell it locally as well to the local estaminet owners. And so quite often it would be drunk behind the lines. But what's really interesting about that rum is those rum jars. We're talking about stone jar here, so 1900 stone jar. It was stamped with the letters SRD, which there are a couple of suggestions about what this is. So probably it's something like Supply Reserve Depot. There are a couple of options, but one thing it definitely gets is the nickname by the British, SRD, seldom reaches destination.
And I just have to come in on that as well about rum, because there's a phrase, it's a little bit archaic now, you probably wouldn't hear it that much now in Britain, but to say something is a rum do. And the origins of rum do, rum do means it's odd, or it's strange, or it's peculiar. It's got a strange connotation. The origins of the phrase rum do really are lost in the mists of time. They might go back to the 1500s. Nobody's entirely sure. But the popularity of the phrase rum do, especially to mean, oh, there's something strange going on, or this is really odd, definitely come from the First World War. A rum do basically means a soldier's got drunk or has had a bit too much rum and something strange has happened, quite often unpleasant. So, he's accidentally pulled a pin out of a grenade, or he's fired his rifle in the air and he's injured somebody, he's injured himself, something strange happened. So the phrase a bit of a rum do actually comes from the First World War when the soldiers were overindulging, although its deeper origins are completely unknown and lost to us.
It's really interesting. There are many of these that we really have to work hard to actually get the background to. There are, of course, others which are in everyday use, even today, and really international. So phrases that are still used that we can draw a very clear line to. And I think probably at the very top of that list would be the phrase over the top, which, of course, refers to going quite literally over the top out into no man's land. Very, very common today, of course, used to describe something that's maybe a little bit too much or a bit full on. The other thing that's really interesting about that is the phrase, perhaps even more popular at the time than going over the top, would be to go over the bags, and that's referring to go over the top of the sandbags. One of those phrases is stuck, Spence, which I find really interesting, whereas the other one really has died out at the end of the First World War.
Yes, that's really interesting, and it's an interesting example, I think, of how language changes and how the interaction between what's said and what's published start to shape the way that language is used. Because as you say, Dan, over the bags is more commonly used, or at least equally used by the British when referring to going what we call over the top. But what tends to get used a lot more in print and in the press in Britain is the phrase over the top, probably because the phrase over the bags, though it's certainly obvious to you if you're a soldier, you're clambering over your sandbags to get out into no man's land, to a reader at home who might not be familiar with that, over the top becomes a much catchier, much more incisive phrase. And as you say, it's used to this day. It's used to apply doing something a little bit over the top, doing more than you need, or being excessive. But I've also seen it used in the sense of you're going to go and face a challenge, or, oh, it's going to be really difficult. Well, let's go over the top. I've heard it used at work, for example. I've heard it used in general conversation. And this is I would say perhaps the phrase over the top is probably the most commonly used phrase that comes from the First World War. And it's used, of course, in the English-speaking world. In fact, there was even a movie, a not very good movie, I have to say, with Sylvester Stallone about arm wrestling that was called Over the Top, that was released in the 1980s. And I thought, just thinking about that now, I wonder what the soldiers of 1918 would think to see that a phrase they were using, or certainly were at least familiar with, it would ultimately be used in a Hollywood movie 60, 70 years later. So it's definitely part of the language. And that leads me on to just another phrase that's connected to over the top that's little bit more obscure in some ways, but is still used in the British military to this day. And this is the word perisher. And perisher refers to a trench periscope initially. A trench periscope is very useful in the trenches. You'd attach them to the trench wall. And just like a submarine periscope, you could turn a crank and the periscope would rise, and you could peer into no man's land without any danger of being shot in the head by a sniper. You could pan it around and you could look around. Exactly why periscopes get called perishers isn't entirely clear, and whether it comes from the Royal Navy or whether it comes from the Army isn't entirely clear, because of course the Royal Navy is operating submarines, they're using periscopes, the Army's using periscopes as well in the trenches. Nobody's entirely clear where it comes from, but somehow periscope gets abbreviated to perisher. So you'd say, have a look through the perisher, and people would know what that meant to look through the periscope. The interesting point for me is that is still used by the Royal Navy to this day. So the Royal Navy has the most demanding submarine commanders course in the entire world, the SMCC, the Submarine Command Course, which actually starts in the First World War, starts around about 1917 because casualties for British submarines are high, and there's got to be better training for the skippers. They need a really demanding course so they don't get killed in action. And it's known colloquially as the Perishers course. And it's still known as that to this day. And in fact, if you're on the Perisher course, you become a perisher. And if you're not aware of the First World War connection, that just seems absolutely bizarre, I'm sure. But there's even been British TV documentaries about the submarine command course, one of which was called Perisher. And without understanding the origin of the phrase, and whether it comes from the Navy or the Army, not entirely clear. They may have developed it roughly simultaneously. But even today, the Royal Navy is using a slang phrase from the First World War for its most demanding training course. And I think that's really fascinating.
Yeah, I really like that one, actually. I wasn't aware of that either, so there we go. I've learned something on this one as well. In fact, I want to go back to a word that you just mentioned a minute ago, which isn't one that's born in the First World War, but it is certainly one that's popularised. And the reason you explained there was that if you don't use a trench periscope, and in fact, let's go for two phrases in one here. If you don't use a trench periscope, you would have to put your head above the parapet, which itself has got its own origins in the First World War, because you might well get shot by a sniper. And sniper is something which goes back, probably has its foundations in and around the American Revolution, actually. But the idea is if somebody was a good enough shot, they would be able to shoot a very elusive bird, which could be found very small, very agile on the wing, known as a snipe. So if you can shoot a snipe with your rifle or with your firearm, you are a particularly good marksman, therefore you are a sniper. And we should mention that telescopic sights really find their birth in 1914, come out with the Germans before they do with the Brits. And it's amazing how these phrases then become, sniper is colloquially known, is known to really everybody today. But prior to 1914, there would have been occasional references here and there, but it wouldn't have been absolutely in the standard British lexicon of the day. And the same can be said with a phrase that we use absolutely regularly today, chat, which is a fascinating story. Now, and I should say, this needs some further research, and there's been quite a lot of work done into this. We do know that the word chat, or to have a conversation, comes about probably in the Middle Ages, but it's not in common use at the time. Certainly it is popularised once soldiers return back from the Western Front. And the story here goes that chat in the British Army prior to the First World War is a word that is known to refer specifically to lice. And we do have proof of this. So we have officers writing home saying they have been getting rid of chats in their uniform. And one of the typical ways to do that is to, once out from the front line, is to take off your tunic and to take a candle and to burn around the seams of your clothing to pop the lice eggs. Lice are a horrific problem in the First War. A lot of people become lousy, which in itself is another phrase used during that time. Now, if to get rid of these lice and to pop these lice eggs, men would often sit round in a communal area, have a conversation, share round candles over a brazier or a fire, and get rid of these chats. And the process became known as chatting, or having a chat. Now, all those years later, remove those 100 years, you still have people sitting around having a conversation, except you remove the candle and the brazier, but the concept still remains. So chatting or having a chat, at least in terms of popularization, very likely has its origins in the First World War, which I find endlessly fascinating.
It is endlessly fascinating. These ideas that come through from the First World War and the origins of which, as you say, are obscure or are debated, such as chatting, I think is a great one, and lousy as well, or lousy. So I feel lousy now in Britain means I feel really bad, and it's usually applied to, you're not feeling well or you're injured in some way, but it can also just mean you feel bad internally, you're demoralized and so on. But at the time, it's interesting, in the First World War, to say you felt lousy meant you were infested with lice. And what you'd say if you felt unwell was you felt seedy. Now, seedy in the English language has actually changed completely. It means being sleazy, being a bit perverted and dirty if you're seedy. But in the First World War, it meant you were ill. You were feeling ill. But somewhere around about 1916, 17, lousy, as a way of saying I feel ill, began to replace seedy, especially for soldiers. And it's interesting, I know of at least one very good, and I highly respect his work, and I like him as a person. I know of one published historian, who got confused about the meaning of seedy and thought that he referred to an officer being sent home because he was listed as he'd become seedy, and he thought he'd been sent home as a disciplinary measure because he was being perverted and naughty behind the lines. In actual fact, he was just extremely ill. And so that's in fact how, even though it's only a century ago, we have to sometimes be a little bit careful with the language, because phrases and terms that were used by the soldiers and the officers of the First World War don't always mean what we think they mean now. And this is one of the reasons why it's such a fantastic subject to keep revisiting, I think.
Yeah, it's amazing. If you look around you at home today, there are so many things, and sometimes there's a kind of a wow moment of realization. I find myself doing it all the time, where you realize there's obviously a connection to certain instances. I think one of those things, clothing is a great example of that, or fashion and attire, these kind of things. Two things that stick in my mind here. One is famously the trench coat. See regularly. That's got a really direct lineage, of course, to the First World War. The other one, which is a little more obscure, and again, this has got slightly predates the First World War, but it's got a real practical benefit in the frontline trenches, and that's the idea of using a wristwatch. So, of course, those of you guys watching this who have seen old photographs before of the late Victorian period, you're going to see those individuals well dressed with that lovely gold chain coming out the side of their waistcoat or something like that, which, of course, is usually attached to a pocket watch, which was by far the most popular method of keeping time in the pre-war years. Now, the reality is, if you're an officer, particularly in 1914, 1915, and then a regular soldier, non-commissioned, in the latter part of the war, one of the things you really want to be able to do is tell the time, but without having the difficulty of removing a watch from your pocket. A good example would be an officer going over the top on some day in battle. Well, in that instance, when you've got perhaps a compass and a map case and a pistol in your hand and a swagger stick tucked under your arm, any number of things, you really need that free hand, that free space, and dipping in and out of your pocket to gather the time, which is, of course, is vital in action. It's going to be really tricky. So what we find became popularized is that people were sending home for women's pocket watches, which were traditionally much smaller, and getting then a leather case constructed around those, wrapping them around their wrist, tying them on, and therefore you have an early wristwatch to pocket watch with a leather case around it, allowing you to tell the time without having to either put your pistol or your map or your compass away. It's a fascinating way that we can see. And of course, that popularity comes back after the First World War and continues to this very day.
It does. It completely revolutionizes fashion. So wristwatches had been around for a while. They were generally an item of women's wear for fashionable about-town women. They wouldn't wear a pocket watch, too heavy, nowhere to put it on their attire, so they wear a wristwatch. And wristwatches started to be used by the army, at least in the Boer War, between 1899 and 1902. Seems partially because officers throwing themselves on the ground with a wristwatch in their pocket, throwing themselves on the ground to take cover from enemy fire, their wristwatch would break or it would jam in them uncomfortably. And by the time of the First World War, wristwatches would become extremely popular. There'd be an incredible industry of wristwatch production that would come out, and they'd get very advanced in a very short space of time, including useful things like luminous dials, so you could use them at night and you could check the time at night. And of course, having a watch is really important for for you, especially if you're an officer, because timing is everything in war. And knowing what time the bombardment's going to take place, knowing what time things are going to happen. In fact, though we can't prove this specifically, it's difficult, the etymology of it's difficult. The phrase synchronized watches, which is sometimes still used now to say, well, make sure we're all on the right time. It may not originate in the First World War, but it certainly is popularized in the First World War, because as a unit was about to prepare itself for action, the timings would be given about what time you're going to leave the trench, the bombardment times, and so on. And you need to make sure everyone's watch is showing the correct time, because if somebody's out by even a minute, that can lead to serious consequences. So synchronized watches, or more specifically, gentlemen synchronized watches, was often the instruction given to your junior officers to make sure they were all on the correct time.
Fascinating stuff. It's the whole idea of the Western Front being an area for evolution, whether it's technology, medical stuff, language, whatever it might be. You know, you can imagine just putting this huge number of people into this incredibly dangerous situation, and just watching this evolution take place must have been a remarkable thing. There are a number of things that come out as a result of this, though. And one of the things I think, which is a little more old-fashioned, but we can still find it in phrases and slang of the time, is the idea of being, if you like, a little more superstitious. And so there are certain practices and things that come about that people won't do as a result of this kind of superstition. Of course, when you're in a very dangerous situation like that, superstition is quite often born. You know, if you're in the Navy, you might, in Napoleonic times, scratch a backstay. If you're in the British Army, and particularly in a trench in the First World War, you certainly would not light your cigarette as the third man or as the third match, because there's a long-held superstition about that practice as well, Spence.
There is, and I've still heard this reference to this day, and the idea being, if you're the third man, or if it takes you 3 strikes of your match to light your cigarette or your pipe, the first illumination, the first cigarette, the sniper sees you. The second illumination, the sniper takes aim, and when you strike your match the third time, the sniper shoots you. And you've actually raised a point, and this is, I fear this is becoming a bit of a catchphrase of the podcast. I'd love to cover this in a future episode. The superstitions on the trenches, because the trench warfare gives rise to an unbelievable number of superstitions. And I think an aspect of warfare that is not really widely recognized is the presence of superstitions and fear of the supernatural, or at least the supernormal, so unusual creatures doing unusual things. And we can see this even in modern war. So in the Iraq War, in the early part of the 21st century, there were all kinds of legends about camel spiders, which are native to Iraq and are really ugly creatures. They're not actually spiders, but they look like spiders. They're big. They've got lots of legs. They're pretty unpleasant looking beasts. And there are all kinds of legends that grew up in both the British and the American army about camel spiders doing strange things. So running at tremendous speed, biting viciously, eating the dead. And that's a great example, even in a modern war, with all our intelligence apparatus, all our education, the internet, soldiers still generated superstitions then. And back in the First World War, where there's a much lower information environment, superstition is massive. And fear of the supernatural is quite high too. Most soldiers' memoirs, or at least a significant number of soldiers' memoirs, include a supernatural element to do with superstitions, to do with this. Another superstition was if you saw the same rat twice, trenches and no man's land, of course, crawling with rats. If you saw the same rat twice, that you were destined to have ill fortune befall you. Now, unless you've got an incredible eye for a rat, your chances of identifying the same rat twice were pretty limited. But people still thought about it. And there were legends about rats doing all kinds of things, dragging men off, many rats latching onto a wounded man and dragging him away, and all these kind of things. And the interest in the supernatural elements of the First World War would actually influence the 1920s as well. There'll be a huge rise in spiritualism in the 1920s. There'd also be a huge rise in horror literature, ghost stories, and even darker stories, such as the work of H.P. Lovecraft, would draw some inspiration from the First World War. So the superstitions of the First World War, endlessly fascinating to me.
Yeah, no doubt we'll come back to that in the future. There's another one of our regular catchphrases for this podcast. To be honest, Spence, there are so many of these things we could cover. What will be fascinating to hear is what you guys think. Which ones stick in your mind? Which ones have we missed out? There are so many that come about and find their heritage from the First World War. I want to finish with a few honourable mentions, Spencer, because we want to go back another 100 years back to particularly naval stuff, because there are some fascinating ones in the Navy which I find equally interesting, and things that are used in everyday life. Not all of these are naval. Some of them clearly are, but let's just rattle off a few here because I find them so interesting. True colours being a great one. So the idea of sailing under, in fact, you've got two here. You've got a sailing under false colours or a false flag. Quite often we hear of false flag operations. That's the idea of hoisting the enemy colours until you're within range and then dropping them and hoisting your true colours, at which point you can then attack the enemy without breaking any rules of war. So that being an obvious one. We've got somebody who was, again, a little worse for wear due to alcohol, might be known as 3 sheets to the wind. In the Royal Navy back in the 1800s, meals were actually served on a square tray and they were locked into place. So on the rocking ship, they would stay in place. Hence the idea of having 3 square meals a day. And my personal favourite, which is, again, there's some question about this, but this is a very British one. It's, you could say, if it was very cold, you could say it was brass monkeys. The full phrase being, you could freeze the balls off a brass monkey, which sounds pretty rude, actually, if you think about it. But the reality is a brass monkey is, in fact, a spacer, if you like. If you think back to an old cannon, if you were to draw a picture of an old cannon in the 18th century, you'd probably draw a little pyramid of cannonballs next to it. Well, they're not stacked directly on top of each other. They're actually stacked using a brass spacer. And so if you imagine you've got different layers with different size spacers in their place, those spacers are made of brass, the cannonballs themselves are made of iron, and if you were on a deck and you were freezing cold, maybe up in the Arctic Circle somewhere, the brass would contract quicker than the iron, and what it would do is squeeze that, it would shrink down that spacer to the point that the balls would fall off. So to freeze the balls off a brass monkey, which I find brilliant. I really, really enjoy that one. Have you got any personal favourites, maybe don't come specifically from the First World War, but have got a military connection?
I have, and my favourite is Bumph. And Bumph probably traces its origin back to the 1600s, referring to sort of paper. But Bumph became the slang term for toilet paper that was used in the trenches. And knowing that the English slang for your backside is bum, you can certainly see why the soldiers adopted this. And toilet paper in the First World War, shall we say, it was not particularly designed for comfort. It was definitely designed for practicality. It was of low quality, but nevertheless, you'd be grateful of it to have it. So Bumph was known as, initially was the nickname given to toilet paper, or even the act of wiping your backside, bumphing, which is a word that's largely vanished from the English language. But at some point, around about 1916, 1917, Bumph transported itself from toilet paper to mean any mass of paperwork. And as somebody who's gone through lots and lots of battalion paperwork and so on, you can see that battalions generate an enormous amount of memoranda, paperwork, reports, details. And not only are they generating this, they're also having paperwork sent down to them from general headquarters. And one of the things that always makes me smile about this is sometimes you'll find a war diary and it's just got loads and loads of memoranda that have been sent from general headquarters, have just been stuffed in at the back of it. And I can just picture some harassed officer. He's got loads of jobs. Some of his soldiers have got blotto and they need to be dealt with. There's a sniper prowling the no man's land that's threatening him. His perisher's broken. His trench coat's got a hole in it, and he's completely brassed off, and he thinks to himself, I can't deal with all this. I'm going to shove all this in the back of my war diary and I'll worry about it later. And around about this time, when there's lots of paperwork being generated, the word Bumph just gets applied to it. Anything that's sent down from general headquarters or any excessive paperwork is Bumph. And of course, the implication is, well, it's lots of paper. You could probably use it to wipe your backside. And I still use the word Bumph now. When somebody's given me a lot of Bumph, they've given me a lot of paperwork, or I've got a lot of Bumph to do. I've got a lot of paperwork to fill in. And if any of you have ever wasted what feels like hours of your precious life filling in forms, then you'll definitely feel a resonance to those harassed officers in 1917 who are also facing the challenges of Bumph. So that's one of my absolute favourites, and I still use it today.
I love it. Very nice. So I think on that note, let's draw this one to a close. It's been fascinating to explore these amazing topics with you. Really enjoy the idea of trying to find out just how the First World War still influences us today. So if we missed any out or you got any particular favourites, either drop it in the comments, send us a quick email, let us know what you think. We'd love to hear your feedback on this episode. And of course, if you enjoyed this one, do please consider checking out our Patreon or just tell somebody about this podcast. That's the best thing that you could do to help support us. Tell a friend that you've heard Dan and Spencer and you found it really interesting. That would be amazing help to us, and it would help us to share the news of this podcast with others.
Just to echo that, and echo what Dan said earlier as well, if you've got a phrase that traces its origin back to the First World War, or you think you have, let us know in the comments. Let's start a discussion about it, because there's so many of these. We could have spent an entire series talking about trench language and its influence. And this is really, it's scratching the surface of a really great and rich subject, and it opens up lots of further discussion for future episodes as well. So let us know your thoughts in the comments, and do remember to leave us a review.
You've been listening to Not So Quiet on the Western Front, a Battle Guide production. If you've enjoyed this podcast, why not check out the Battle Guide YouTube channel, where we regularly release documentaries exploring some of the most famous and extraordinary episodes from throughout military history. If you'd like to support the Battle Guide team to create more content just like this, why not head over to our Patreon, where for the cost of just a cup of coffee, you can get access to full-length virtual battlefield tours, exclusive behind-the-scenes content, decide which subjects we cover in future podcasts and videos, and join a fantastic community of like-minded people. That's all this time. See you again soon.
Do this again. I'll complete tripping over Fred Judge Waters. Third time's the charm.